Few examples to really give us a sense of what we are talking about when we talk about um, the Yerushalmi, its relationship to the two Tannaitic sources, its relationship to the Bavli. So um, this is both. This first example is meant both as an illustration of how the Yerushalmi works and how it's structured, and to show you a few of the key kind of relational uh, patterns that make it so valuable. So we're going to start quickly by looking at this very brief memra slash sugya from the Bavli, um, and then for which the Yerushalmi sugya we're going to look at is the background. So the subject is the mitzvah of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach at the Seder. Rabbi Elazar, Nashim chayavot b'achilat matzah dvar Torah. Women are obligated to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach, dvar Torah, deoraita. It's weird. It is weird wording. It is unusual that it would make a point of saying that something is true, dvar Torah. But there you go. The women are chayavot in eating matzah. Why would we even need to say that? There are a couple of different, the most obvious answer to that, although perhaps not the best answer, is that it, it you might easily think that it is grouped in uh, in that network of positive time-bound mitzvot from which women are exempt. Not that there's really any universal rule as such, which it turns out there is not. But nonetheless, um, you could easily see that eating matzah would be connected to sitting in the sukkah and wearing tzitzit and some of the other things that are in fact on the list of things from which women are exempt. But they are chayavot in achilat matzah dvar Torah, shene'emar, brings a pasuk, lo tochal alav chametz, v'gomer, you should not eat chametz on it. And then he says, kol sheyeshno bebal tochal chametz. Anyone who has the obligation, is obligated in not eating chametz, in the prohibition on chametz. Yeshno is obligated, has an obligation. B'achilat matzah. Anyone who has the obligation, the negative obligation, to not eat chametz, also has the positive obligation to eat matzah. The negative and the positive, the two converse mitzvot, go together. If you have one, you have the other. V'hani nashe nami, and these women, right? Ho'il v'yeshnan b'bal Torah chametz, because they are certainly obligated in the negative mitzvah. They are obligated equally with men in all prohibitions. Because they are obligated in the prohibition on chametz, therefore, based on this rule, they must also be obligated obligated to eat matzah. Now, there are a number of ways in which this is a confusing little teaching. It doesn't explain the relationship between this this pasuk, of which it only quotes one phrase, and this seeming guiding principle. if you watched, if you have already gone through the Mishnah mini course, you will remember the midrash that we are about to get to, um, and the original pasuk where this phrase "you shall not eat chametz" over it is connected to the following phrase, "For 7 days you shall eat matzah." But Rabbi Elazar does not, in fact, quote that. Um, and then he jumps from that to from this pasuk. There is uh, this sort of essential linkage between these two mirror image mitzvot, and that um, and women are fall into that category, right? And therefore their obligation is explained by this. Now, um, the the idea of this principle coming from this verse, even when you look at the full verse, is interesting, but not certainly not obvious. And there certainly is nothing in the verse to suggest a connection to women um, and their obligation. And yet, it is not. It's not. It's not. So it's this is not a text that you would look at and it would jump out at you as being troubling or problematic. But it is certainly one where a it's not at all clear why Rabbi Elazar comes out and needs to make a specific declaration um, about women's obligation in matzah, in eating matzah, um, nor why this particular uh, midrash, we'll call it, because it is in its origin at least a midrash, is or certainly why this verse is a relevant support for this point. Now, these kind of features are classic characteristics of secondary reworkings of earlier texts, as we shall see. So, this source, these two we saw in the Mishnah course. So, um, I refer you back to that for greater depth. But the two verses about the 14th and 15th of Nisan, on the afternoon of the 14th, you vizavachta Pesach, uh, you you sacrifice the Pesach offering um, at the temple. Lo tochal alav chametz, you shall not eat chametz with it or over it, which at first glance means with or over the sacrificing of the Pesach. But then it goes on to say, Shivat yimim tochal alav matzot. For 7 days you shall eat matzot over it. And now, on the one hand, the Pesach has to be offered, has to be sacrificed before the night of the 15th, because it has to be slaughtered and prepared and roasted and ready to be eaten at night. So it's being slaughtered during the day of the 14th. But the 7 days of Chag HaMatzot, the 7 days during which one eats matzah, are very clearly the 7 days from the 15th to the 21st. So beginning at at nightfall when the 15th of Nisan begins. So the midrash here from this fray is asking the question of when does the prohibition of chametz start? Does it start in the afternoon of the 14th, when one could, in theory, be offering the Pesach sacrifice, or does the prohibition of chametz, at least dvar arish from the Torah, not begin until nightfall, because this phrase lo tochal alav chametz is connected to the following phrase, for 7 days tochal alav matzot. Rabbi Yehuda says it's connected to the Pesach. Rabbi Shimon says, no, but it says lo tuchal alav chametz and shivat yamim tuchal alav matzot. It connects the chametz, the not eating chametz, to eating matzot, and the lesson slash rule that he derives from this is et shehu b'kum machol matzah, one who is obligated in the positive mitzvah of eating matzah is obligated in the prohibition on chametz. One who is not obligated to eat matzah is not prohibited from eating chametz. He is referring, of course, to time. When we are obligated to eat matzah, only then are we forbidden from eating chametz, and until the mitzvah to eat matzah goes into effect, ayat sundown, the prohibition on chametz does not either. Here now is the Yerushalmi, kind of what we've been getting to. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Pischan shel nashim chova v'dochin alav Shabbat. So Rabbi Elazar notes that nashim are obligated in the Korban Pesach, and that obligation means that also one can violate Shabbat in order to do so. Right? That would be if the Seder is Saturday night, they would in fact have to slaughter the Pesach sacrifices on Shabbat in order to be able to eat it the night of the 15th. Okay. So we begin with that rule, and now we ask a follow-up question. Matzatan mahi. What about their matzah? Meaning, that women are obligated in the Korban Pesach. Are they also obligated in eating matzah? Rabbi Elazar Amar Chova. Rabbi Elazar says they are obligated. Now, then Rabbi Zora says, actually, there was a debate about that. Rabbi Hillel says, no, everyone agrees they are obligated. I'm actually going to skip down, although there's a lot more to say about this sugya, to the last two lines. There's a Breita that supports Rabbi Hila, who said everyone agrees that women are obligated to eat matzah. What's the Breita that supports Rabbi Hila? Here is the Midrash. Now, when Yerushalmi is quoting this Midrash Halacha, you can be confident that what the Yerushalmi had was the Midrash Halacha as we have it. Right? First of all, it quotes the whole, both relevant parts of the verse, right? Because the point is that lo tochal alav and shivat yamim tochal alav match, and then it has Rabbi Shimon's takeaway. Et shehu be. Notice exactly the words here. Et shehu be this, harehu be that. Et shehu be bal tochal chametz, one who is prohibited from chametz, harehu b'kum machol matzah, is obligated also to eat matzah. Now, here we have come to now not a change that happens somewhere, but a concrete change, sort of like fiddling with the source to fit a new context. I could show you that this same midrash, but in exactly the version we have in the Sifrei, appears elsewhere in the Yerushalmi in the context of the discussion about about the time for the prohibition of chametz, but here they've taken this this statement, this broader rule, and they have flipped it. Instead of only those who are obligated in the positive are obligated in the negative, now they change it to, oh, anyone who's obligated in the negative is obligated in the positive. Now I know that this is the original form of this midrash because this is very clearly based on the interpretive problem of pasuk and the rule that he articulates emerges directly from the language of the verse, from the repeating of the word alav. Here, it doesn't. Here, there's nothing that would lead me independently to this idea, and the idea that the mitzvot of Hametz and Matzah are connected, and specifically in terms of who is obligated to do so. They have adapted the earlier midrash to resolve a question that they had about women's obligation in matzah, right? Partially because there is another breita from the Tosefta, which, depending on how you read it, it is a little bit of a confusing statement, but depending on how you read it, may indicate that there's a machloket about whether women are obligated in matzah. And so Rabbi Hila has edited this breita, this midrash, just by flipping this phrase from those obligated in the positive are also obligated in the negative to those obligated in the negative are also obligated in the positive, to then be able to essentially to make his additional point. This is not part of the breita, although it looks like it. See, the negative and the positive have to go hand in hand. And since we know that women are obligated in the negative, they must also be obligated in the positive. So what we have is a statement, a question, an answer by an Amora, and then a debate about whether this question was subject to machloket or was accepted by everyone. We have one breita that supports the view that there was a machloket, and that is essentially why the Yerushalmi harnesses this and transforms this midrash into a into evidence that into a reasoning for why women must be obligated in eating matzah. Now, when we look back at the Bavli, here's what I want you to see. What's the relationship between this and the Yerushalmi sugya? This Bavli sugya is actually much shorter than the Yerushalmi sugya because essentially the Bavli has simply taken the conclusion of the Yerushalmi sugya. Right? It just has the declarative statement they are obligated. It's not even allude to any question about that. It states they are obligated, and it quotes this new kind of revised version of the midrash. Right? Do not sort of like get to derail saying, well, maybe they just had the same idea. They didn't. The fact that it's Rabbi Elazar in both Talmuds, and it's the same editing, altering of the Midrash. It's clear they are a single tradition, and in this case, what happened is the Bavli had this complicated, confusing sugya and essentially compressed it and only recorded uh, the outcome, the conclusion. They essentially, and this is a common thing. In this case, they just record the sort of conclusion of the Yerushalmi sugya. In many other sugyot, they will have the conclusion of the Yerushalmi sugya, and then that will be the starting point for the Bavli's conversation. And they will kind of build off of that and sort of discuss that conclusion. But you understand what's happening in the Bavli much more clearly when you understand that that this little uh, terse piece of text is the outcome of this longer conversation. So again, an example of a Yerushalmi sugya where the Bavli clearly knew the Yerushalmi sugya, compresses it down to uh, the legal conclusion in the name of Rabbi Elazar, and using the exact midrash source that the Yerushalmi uses to support that position. One more source that we'll look at one more simple example, and then the more involved example that I want to look at, we will save for next time. This is a Mishnah from Megillah about Torah reading. The Mishnah says, Bashani u'chamishi u'b'shabbat mincha. So on Monday, Thursday, Shabbat mincha, korin kisidran, you read the next Torah reading. Ve'ein olin lahem min hacheshbon. But it doesn't count, meaning that having read that first aliyah on Monday morning, it's not considered taken care of. You don't start the following time at the second aliyah and then the third. It doesn't count. You have to start at the beginning of the parsha each Shabbat morning. Simple thing that describes, in fact, the practice as we can still do it today. The Tosefta records, however, a machloket on this point, and this is one of those cases where it seems clear that there was prior to the Mishnah some difference of opinion about this practice, and Rebbe essentially selected and only one of the positions to include. But the Tosefta, which is, let's imagine, to be the more original version of the teaching, reads, Mimakom sheposkin Shabbat shacharit, from the place that you stopped on Shabbat morning, Sham matchilim mincha. That's where you start from at mincha. Bemincha misham matchilim b'sheni. Where you stopped at the end of mincha, that's where you start on Monday. And where you end on Monday, you start on Thursday, and then the next Shabbat morning, you start from after the sections read on Monday, on Shabbat Mincha, Monday, and then Thursday. Misham matchilim v'Shabbat haba. That's where you start the following Shabbat. Rabbi Yehuda says, Makom sheposkim b'Shabbat shacharit, the place that you end Shabbat shacharit, misham matchilim l'Shabbat haba. In fact, the place that you end Shabbat shacharit you start from there when you read the following Shabbat morning. So we only count in terms of progressing through the Torah, the readings done on Shabbat morning. Now notice the Mishnah is, in a way, it combines some of the language of the first view, but the halacha of Rabbi Yehuda mentions, because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't even mention the Mincha Monday and Thursday readings, whereas the Mishnah has combined. It says, oh, on Sheni and Chamishi and Shabbat Mincha, we do read, but following Rabbi Yehuda's halacha, the next Shabbat morning we start from the very beginning of that parasha. So what you have is the Mishnah and the Tosefta are two statements of the same halacha in somewhat different in very different wording. Right? What he says when Rabbi Yehuda just says Misham Machilin, from there you start the next Shabbat. The Mishnah has introduced the term the Ein Olin Lahen Min HaCheshbon. Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat Mincha don't count towards your progress. You don't get points. Now, the Yerushalmi says on the phrase from the Mishnah, Ve'eno oleh lahem min hachishbon, which is that was the phrase from the Mishnah. The Yerushalmi says very briefly and succinctly, It tane. There are those who teach oleh lahem min hachishbon. There are those who teach no, they do count. Now, is this a breita that we do not have otherwise attested? No, it is not. What is it? It is simply noting the opposing halachic position that we see in the Tosefta. In other words, the Amoraim they know the Tosefta, and they say something that we also see in the Bavli. Oh, the Mishnah says it doesn't count. Oh, but there is also a Tannaitic view that it does count. Why does the Yerushalmi not use the language of the Tosefta, aside from being much longer? Because the Yerushalmi is simply expressing the idea using the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said it doesn't count. The Yerushalmi says, oh, there's that Tosefta, though, that says it does count, even though the Tosefta doesn't use that language, because the Yerushalmi is simply paraphrasing. There's no need to quote the entire source. It is simply noting the halachic position represented. Rabbi Zira Abba, this is a chain of rabbis. Rabbi Zira, in the name of Rav Matna, says in the name of Shmuel, Halacha kamisha hu omer eino oleli min hacheshbon kematniti. The halacha follows those who say it doesn't count, like the Mishnah. Okay, so we have a brief allusion to the Tosefta, and then a ruling from Shmuel, from Rav Mat in the name of Shmuel, that the halacha follows the Mishnah. And now, just look quickly at the Breita, at the Bavli. Tanu Rabbanan. Right, this is in the Bavli on Mishnah. There's a Breita. And it proceeds to quote, word for word, the entire Tosefta, as we have it. Expressing both positions. First, the position that we do progress gradually from Monday to Thursday to Shabbat, and Rabbi Yehuda says that we do not. Amar Rabbi Zera. We now have a comment on that. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav Matna, Amar Rabbi Matna, Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Zera, Matna, Shmuel. Look up at the Yerushalmi. Same phrase. Halacha, makom shemafsikim b'Shabbat shacharit, sham korim mincha u'b'sheni u'b'chamishi u'l'Shabbat ha'ba'ah. The law is, essentially, is that it doesn't count. The Bavli is confused with this. Well, why didn't you say halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda? And the answer is, oh, people are confused about which one is Rabbi Yehuda and which one's not Rabbi Yehuda. But looking at comparing these two little snippets of Yerushalmi and Bavli, I can tell you for sure two things. One, the Bavli Sugya is a direct adaptation of the Yerushalmi Sugya. How do I know that? Because we have a quote of the exact Tosefta that the Yerushalmi was simply paraphrasing, alluding to, and a Memra from the exact, and it's not just one Amora, but the chain of three Amoraim. They're the exact same as Rabbi Zera, Rav Matna, Shmuel. The same three rabbis named to tell us the halacha follows the Mishnah view, the Rabbi Yehuda view, that it does not count. But it doesn't say. But the Gemara's response. Well, why don't you just say the halachas follows Rabbi Yehuda, or the halacha follows the Mishnah? Either one. Their question is a good one. Why not? Why say, oh, why say halacha and then describe it in sort of at length? But I know the answer to that question. The answer is that the Yerushalmi just paraphrased the Tosefta, didn't mention Rabbi Yehuda's name, and Shmuel is saying the halacha follows, and he has to say which view it follows because there isn't a name attached to either one. And his point being, oh, it follows the ones who say it doesn't count, like the Mishnah. In other words, he is in fact making the point that we follow the view in the Mishnah. Now, what this is telling me is that this little Bavli Sugya is directly based on this Yerushalmi, except, including the exact form of the Maimer that brings a ruling, except that where the Yerushalmi has very briefly paraphrased the Tosefta, the Bavli inserts the entire quote, the entire original text. Why does the Bavli do that? It is in part in the nature of the Bavli's kind of tendency to want to include as many sources and preserve as many sources as they can. But also, the other thing to that sort of examples like this show is that the Babylonian rabbis received these Yerushalmi sugyot from Israel, and at some later point they were separately brought the Tosefta as a collection, which they hadn't previously had, so sort of as an actual edited collection, and one can imagine that they discovered there whole texts that convey or represent halachic positions that they are familiar with because they're alluded to in Yerushalmi Sugyot. And in many, many places, the Babylonians, who otherwise are in this case, very closely following and adhering to the Yerushalmi sugya that they received, um, replace the paraphrase with a fuller and more exact and more exact and more careful quote of the original source.